All right. Welcome to the last profiling call in January. Uh, we have, I would say, like a pretty decent agenda today, though we do have spots if there are topics that folks want to add on to it. In our traditional kind of housekeeping, the first two I think are a few that we've reported out in the past, which is the working group meeting is next week. I checked today and I got an email yesterday. I think it's still possible to register. And just like we mentioned in the past, HL7 Canada members do get a discount. The early bird is no longer available, but I will put the registration link that I had for my email in the chat if I can.
And as Elliot pointed out last time, the difference between member and non-member rates is more than the cost of a Canadian membership.
Yes, so
I think it's $350 for members and $525 for non-members US, and a Canadian membership costs $100 Canadian.
Yeah. So if you've been holding out on the decision to attend the virtual one, that discount still holds, and it's still, I think, a pretty good value proposition. The other one I'm just keeping it because I think it's kind of helpful as we actually get prepared for our upcoming profiling calls. We'll be talking about application of the terminology components into the CA baseline, just to make folks aware. You haven't seen the updates that have come through on Info Central about the Pan-Canadian terminology server that and the updates that have been happening to get it integrated with the HL7 ecosystem. And if you're interested in utilizing it, the form that's associated with requesting an API key, which I'm thinking we should probably actually fill out that form maybe at the end of the session, because we'll be one of our upcoming profiling calls. We're looking to start working through the process of applying the configuration details into our CA baseline implementation guide so that we can take advantage and leverage the ability to have the PanCan terminology server called when we are including Pan-Canadian terminology content in our guide. So I have okay.
One related question that occurred to me when the announcement went out about retiring Terminology Gateway. There were places, I think, where we had references to Terminology Gateway in our guide. And we might want to make sure that we don't have any of those anymore before they retire it.
Was that another announcement? Was that a recent one? I know we've talked about it in the past, but was there another one?
Well, yeah, it came out to the HL7 Canada list in the last week or so.
I think it was on about 3 different forums where there was a announcement of new capabilities coming in with the terminology server, updates, changes, various things like that. And oh, by the way, remember everybody, the gateway is going away beginning of March or something like that.
Sometime in March, yeah.
Okay, and I'm just gonna get the link to that. So that might be
edit. Sorry, as you mentioned, the gateway will be going away. Any replacement? What's the name of the replacement? Or just temporary shutdown? Could you provide more information?
Well, the terminology server. Go ahead.
I was going to say, we don't have anyone here today from Infoway to actually authoritatively speak on this.
Yeah, all we know is what was in the notice. But the terminology server is the service that's supposed to replace the terminology gateway, in terms of that part of your question, Thomas.
Oh, gotcha. Thank you. I treat this kind of either upgrade or a kind of replacement. Coming. Thanks.
and Lorraine, this was the post you were referring to, right? Subset and activation.
Hang on, I'm just making it bigger so I can read it. Just a sec.
While you're doing that, it appears from up above your slide that that terminology server may not be available outside of Canada.
Yes, that was something I think Elliot you had touched on a couple weeks ago, right?
I don't
this
know.
Is actually an earlier note, I think. Actually, that did come up at some point Elliot. I'm just trying to remember where it did. But I think that's an earlier note than the one I saw.
Where's this one?
Yeah, there was a note that came out yesterday.
Maybe it was in implementers.
Sorry, I've already packed up my laptop, so I don't have.
Well, I'm gonna do the one that, like, the inactivation one, because I think that one, like, is probably most aligned to what you were describing, that we'll just have to do a check to see what
Yeah.
we're using that isn't in the PPCAN terminology server.
I don't think we have a lot that would be affected, but we might have one or two value sets. I know the initial back 6 months ago when they were retiring value sets, they were retiring one of the value sets we use in the provider space. And we pushed back and asked for it to stay for a little while. But yeah, it's just worth a check just to see if we're affected by any of that.
Yeah. So I think we have it might even be on not the next profiling call, but the one after that we thought we might slot. But I'll get to the one of the agenda topics for today is actually to go through potential like sequencing for future profiling and governance calls, talking through some of the most like the near immediate things that we want to make sure we get on the docket, but also to see if there's any places that we know there's currently going to be gaps with guest hosts, or interest gaps with topics, if there are ideas and folks that kind of want to fill in those gaps. So this might be one that we just add to that kind of tentative schedule. The only other item, okay, so actually there's one more housekeeping item, which was we talked about this in the last governance, and we said before formally issuing a cancellation, we'd bring it to profiling. The call on 2/7, some folks will be available, some folks will be traveling. It's like the last day of the Projectathon Plugathon, but it technically is following the like the formal events. I won't be available to host, but if there's somebody who wants to guest host, we can get you the information. We just would need effectively somebody who would be interested in essentially logging in, starting the session, and then likely it would be tackling the issue log items, or it would be if there was a particular topic that folks want to discuss. Otherwise, I think we'll likely cancel it if we don't hear from anyone today that there's interest in that, attending that 2/7 call, which was 2 weeks from now. We have any takers?
I was gonna. Paul, go ahead.
Oh no, you go ahead. I was just gonna say it's gonna be hard for participants who are coming out of that meeting to do that.
Yeah,
But
I was gonna say that I suspect I could have something ready to talk about terminology services by that point. But I don't know that I want to do that on a call that will have lower participation.
No. So I think, right now, tentatively, I think we thought about the following profiling call being slotted in for when we start talking through application of the terminology configuration items. So unless I hear any differently, what we'll do is we'll add this one on the list for cancellation. Last call if anyone wants to guest host. All right. We will get that updated in the calendar and on the agenda, or typically I think you guys will receive, like when we cancel it in Zoom, like notification of the instance being canceled. All right, so that's the last housekeeping item. In terms of standing items for today, I think we've got maybe 3 triage items, some that we kind of hinted at the last time that we met for profiling, some that it probably makes sense to go through and actually kind of write the content for the triage item today. That's what stands between us and the 1.2 going out as a package. So seems like a reasonable thing to try to tackle on today's agenda. And then I kind of hinted at this earlier, just taking folks through kind of what we have right now slotted in for potential coverage for sessions in the kind of March to May, June period, and going through if we think the sequencing makes sense and if there's any interest in filling in some gaps that we currently know we'll have in terms of host coverage. Anything else people want to add to the agenda for today? All right. I think we then can jump to the first item, which is just, we've been trying to do this kind of update on what, where we're sitting. So there are a few additional submitted tickets that was expected. I think last week we actually, one of them came from Elliot after might have been 2 weeks ago. We're discussing an item that would be helpful for 2.0. So submitted is often things that like we haven't had a chance to thoroughly talk through or hasn't been slotted into like a session yet to have a discussion around. Most of the things in the submitted column, I think, are kind of 2.0 or later. But we're still kind of, we've made our way through anything that's ready to be applied, and that leaves us with the kind of the 3 things that are in that triage state, which we're hoping to, if not close out today, get very, very close to closing out. And those 3 items, this one I kind of hinted at the last profiling call, which was the special URI parameter. It's been applied, but I thought it's one of those things that when I started seeing the warnings in a lot of my guides, I started seeing it in a bunch of different places. So I thought it might be helpful to kind of show how we worked around this warning before closing out the ticket for good. There's a one that is essentially just I go through kind of current state, what the CI bill warnings and errors are, confirming if there's any that are, oh, sorry, this is ignore warnings file. So this is actually going through and maybe cleaning up the way that we've got a lot of duplicates and a lot of kind of messiness in our ignore warnings file, which is what suppresses warnings in IG Publisher when we go to publish to the web. So there's a kind of just basically a cleanup ticket. And then this one, which I thought made the most sense to apply the brain power on the call, because we've talked quite a lot in the past around socialization of extensions. And I have a little bit of text from a prior ticket, but we thought it would be helpful. It's helpful, I think, regardless. It might be more of a 2.0 topic, but having some type of markdown page that describes, you know, what our process is for socializing extensions, either using their host canonical URL or using a baseline URL. So thought we could write that together and decide where it should go in the guide to close that out. So the first one's easiest, so I think we'll go to that one, and it's just kind of a quick show and tell. This guy over. And it's 2296. So this one was one where we got like a lot of feedback about, oh, there's a lot of these extensions that we're seeing, particularly in BC. We were asked a number of years ago to kind of review them and make the determination whether or not this would be something that we could then socialize in the baseline. We reviewed some of them and identified a handful as likely to be kind of usable and aligned to use outside of BC in terms of like either other jurisdictions or other implementation guides, and those at the time were the address, the value period, and the communication purpose. And when we looked through the remainder of ones, folks were kind of on the fence about some of these, and so they had said, well, can we have some that we're like, clearly this is jurisdictional specific, and others that we might be able to note as potentially helpful for reevaluation in the future, and ultimately to kind of include a markdown page to identify like, you know, why do we have some extensions over others? So that's the one I think that we will jump to here in a second, but there's another one that actually I've already given the framing for this one, so maybe we'll just do this first, and then we'll go to the easy one. So if you've been looking at the baseline, you'll notice that there are some cases, and our extensions are pretty limited. The majority of the ones that we have socialized from elsewhere are on patient or they're on medication, because there were a few that came from Prescribe It that we said that's heavily reusable. We'll want to start by figuring out, I think, where in the baseline guide any documentation around extension processes should live. And I had a look before we started the call, in our, we don't have a ton of pages to really pull from. We have content written on home. I'll zoom in. And largely this is around like the guide in general. And then we've got general guidance, which to me, I think maybe somewhere here it might make sense, because this is where we talk about choices that we've made about modeling. There's security, which is kind of pretty standard with the convention of what gets included in other guides. And then there's development process, where we talk a lot about like our intent and kind of our current roadmap, and maybe there's a fit for this in the profile development process. So this tends to be a little bit more like oriented towards describing our journey rather than describing like our process for determining whether or not something is an extension that we include or not. So other than that, the only other pages that we really have are these FHIR artifacts, which, I mean, technically we do have this subpage where we talk about, like, and we list our extensions here. But I think as a group, we need to decide, like, does this fit under one of our existing sections before we start making the markdown, or is it something that we think needs its own page? And if so, what it should be called. Do folks feel strongly about any one of those first steps? Like, my proposition is it probably fits somewhere in general guidance. Does that make sense to folks?
I think putting it here makes sense.
And then this is like a huge chunk of must support interpretation things, and conformance language. Does it make sense to kind of have it below this and not break this up further? The reason I ask is I'm going to actually pull up the markdown files, and I just want to make sure that we're putting it where we want it to be able to live. So here's all this big chunky blocks around must support, cardinality and must support, and how to interpret that, conformance languages, or sorry, conformance language. And I think it would probably be at this level, I'm guessing. If we were to add that in, so like socialized extensions. We can also have a look at, I like to, because one of the other guides that is very commonly socialized as extensions is the AU base. We can see if let's see if they have a particular place in their guidance. Looks like maybe not. It's a shame. Okay. All right. So if socialized extensions, I mean, it's been a design choice that we've been making for a while now. The text that I got, so let me actually just, so we're working all in one place. So there's this. Any guidance or process around socialized extensions. And there's also in this ticket, a list of extensions that were reviewed, but were maybes. I think they were. So this is what we had here, which was like following extensions were reviewed. We can choose to list them in the guide if we think that would be valuable, or we can kind of keep them in the ticket and know that we should evaluate them in the future. How valuable is it after we have the let's say it's like purpose of socialized extensions and socialized extensions, something like this. How important is it that we have an actual list of extensions to evaluate in the future that we don't socialize today as part of what actually gets onto this page of the guide? Do people feel strongly about that?
So from my perspective, sorry, I haven't chance to look at those extensions in details by myself, but what I would like to share is some kind of my opinion regarding how to handle the extensions, and so a little bit kind of just lengthy, but just a couple minutes. Hope it can that way matter. My understanding about extension.
Yeah,
Sorry.
before you do, Thomas, I want to anchor us a little bit on like just to make sure if your thoughts are in how we handle extensions, if they are in line with what we've previously documented first. So actually, is it okay if I go over that first and then you can comment if there's like additional details? Because I want to make sure that we're not getting into a conversation where we'd be retracking and changing things that we've previously said, like would be our approach to extensions.
For sure, thanks.
Okay,
Yeah.
I won't take much time at all.
Okay, sure. I just step back into this, and I'm just now seeing the term socialized. Do you mind describing what you mean by socialized? I
So
apologize for slowing things down.
yeah, absolutely. So when we say socialized in the context of extensions, it means that we're exposing the extension or exposing the concept or mapping, but not applying constraints. So we're providing it for the purposes of assisting with harmonization, but not applying like a must support or cardinality, or oftentimes restricting its use or enforcing its use in any way.
Okay, so let me see if I understand what that means operationally. So these are extensions which are proposed, but they are not in fact part of the specification.
So part of our criteria, when we discussed it in 2022, was that they are extensions, if they were to be hosted, or at least, I shouldn't say hosted, if they were to be identified and socialized on a CA baseline profile, that it would be something that already existed, rather than folks coming to us and saying, we really want an extension for X, and therefore, can you make that up for the first time? And that was reiterated, I think, when that choice to basically say, we're not going to make up anything new, but we will raise things that already exist in later in that year, where we basically said, we'll socialize existing extensions and will not scope development of net new. So in order to kind of reduce that uncertainty around duplication, but raise these requests to essentially their respective places where they might be able to kind of address the net new creation of the content.
Excellent understanding.
Yeah, Paul, the way I look at it is there's a whole bunch of extensions out there for, let's say, race or whatever we're going to call it. And that's part of the problem. So we might include one of them as an entirely optional element in the patient resource, or as an optional extension in the patient resource, just to say, if you're thinking of capturing this, we think this is the best one to use in the Canadian context.
Okay,
So that we don't end up with 15 different extensions, all for approximately the same thing.
So this is in fact making people aware of extensions that exist in other places, but this is not proposing extensions nor approving, if you will.
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay, so with that framing, Thomas, you had mentioned that you had some comments on the extension kind of approach, and particularly kind of what we should be documenting.
Yeah, it's just as what expected. I thank you for all those, people around table give very such clear, explanation and description in their manner. I thought we might just consider to put a placeholder in the baseline somewhere, not put on the face page, because if it's possible, we could put a URL link directly to that original extension where they're sitting on certain within each PT their territory. In that manner, we can keep those persistent extension alive. And I do believe, at least your comments great, and my rephrase summary just increase exposure and the reusability, so that we don't reinvent the wheel down the down the road. That's my very brief comment here. Yielding back.
Yeah, in terms of your original question, Sheridan, about how much of, the things like we've identified that there's a bunch of, for instance, there were a bunch of BC extensions that we evaluated and set aside for future consideration. Like the ones that we think are likely candidates to be promoted beyond a jurisdiction are worth listing, but I'm not sure we want to try to start tracking all of the jurisdictional specific extensions across the various jurisdictions, other than be linking to those specifications, because I think the list could get large and unwieldy.
And out of date. What if we put like implementers are encouraged to like, rather than listing them, are encouraged to review like extensions that exist on other guides in the Canadian Fire Registry, to promote harmonization, even if the extensions aren't listed in the CA baseline. I mean, we could even talk about like, how do you do the filter to just find extensions for use in Canada, but it might just be simpler to just say, we're encouraging you to review other more formal extensions.
I don't know what's the relationship between the HR7 International Fire International with the HR7 Canada, because the fire registry located at least logically on the HR7 International side should be treated as a source of truth in that manner. However, I do say the similar registry located, on the simplifier. In that manner, I'm not sure if there's any possibility. That's definitely falling in the governance discussion. But to my understanding, from a technical perspective, if we can uniform the one-stop shopping, that option, and to ease the implementer in Canada, especially to look for those feasible extension to fit in their use case project instead of reinventing the wheel again.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
had the similar concern in the Veterans Affairs in the States, where it's a siloed organization and tends to result in the creation of local things when people can't readily find things to use. And so I put together a guidance to a pattern for people to follow in terms of looking for extensions, which would guide them to using more globally available extensions rather than creating their own first, which I could surface. It would be useful.
Yeah, if you've got content that you think we should pop in here, just circling back though, Thomas, to your point, which is there's two registries right now to point to. This one requires, the one from HL7 International, this FHIR.org registry does require iGuide authors to perform a secondary step. It's not automatically fed through the package registry, which is leading me to probably think that this, like pointing out the Canadian Fire Registry in which the baseline right now is identified as a probably more meaningful space for tell people to check out other guides so that they are, you know, reviewing and considering the structures of other extensions when they're developing their work.
Yeah,
But there's hundreds of guides.
yes, it's an ongoing problem. I mean, we had an issue in BC with the sub project trying to redefine guidance around data absent reason that was already in the provincial jurisdictional guide. So it's something that actually takes attention to reduce the entropy.
Well, we could still point them to the extension registry though. And that would be like the international ones plus this one, right?
Well, as my observation here, I do sense, as Sheridan you mentioned, there is authority issue there. And manner, I don't know if it's a simplifier should be our first choice here in the manner, but I do see actually when I use my word, maybe not really properly. Please correct me. For the as Lauren mentioned, the simplifier registry is a really meaty and muddy, you know, in that way organized. So, you know, if that's possible, we need to find a way, try to clean up this registry, make it easier to search and accessible for the implementers to find what they really need contents.
Well, I think that, I mean, ultimately, I mean, we can tell them here's how you perform a filter based on extensions with a tag of nationality for CA. But I think it's way more likely that the filters in like the way that we describe that would change over time compared to just being like, hey, make sure you're checking out other guides in this thing that like this is a URL that probably isn't going to change anytime soon. Right. And I know obviously like the idea is you have to search for terms that sound similar to what you're trying to do, but you know, it's for a paragraph in a guide, right? That we want to keep from getting out of date over time.
Well, if we think there's only two location and we would like to discuss, maybe reposition back to our web page as just show on the screen, how we, you know, redraft the wording on the baseline web page to direct the potential users go through the chain of this repository so they could find those what they need, the content in the more efficient and right away.
Yeah, perhaps what we should do is separate the strategy from the concrete sites and list both. So the strategy you'd want people to follow would be to go to the international registry, then to go to a countrywide, then to go to a jurisdictional, and then organizational, and then to the project. And you could then list which of those registries currently exist.
And I think we just have the national one. I don't think we have a jurisdictional.
That is the jurisdiction when the jurisdiction is Canada.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, but in Switzerland, that's not the case, right? But they would have the same international one. Now, from the Canadian one, there may in fact be an Ontario or a BC set of them. They're not necessarily held inside a FHIR registry. It might be a document, an implementation guide, a PDF, a website, or something, right? And then inside OHIP or WCB or something, they may have additional local extensions that they use in order to support something. The project may have developed some, etc. But if you start from the highest level, most general, and then come down to the specific, then you're less likely to have these behaviors we've seen of 3 teams on a project coming up with the same with different extensions for the same concept, right? Or 3 projects within a province, or 3 different provinces, or 3 different countries, right? But that's only going to work if you scan them from the most general down to the most specific, if they exist.
So do we like this? So implement is encouraged to review. Here's the international extension pack and extensions used by other projects instead of guides. To review extensions that may be relevant to their jurisdiction and or use case.
Okay, but you're combining together the concrete implementations of them with the space where they may exist. I.e., so you want to go to the standards related list of extensions, then to a country list, sub-country, organization, project.
That would be more like there's a FHIR implementation iGuide author guidance. That's like a generic guidance that exists out there for IG authors. I would think that if we were to introduce this section, we want to be like more practical towards like Canadian implementers for the purposes of harmonization.
Which means if a province goes and stands up a registry, your guide will have to be updated.
No, I don't think.
Yes, because you will list it.
Because that's up to the province itself. I mean, when they build their own extension, they should have it in their registry and or put it up in that HL7 or the Canada registry in addition. So that's a process. The same with when you're doing OIDs and stuff. If you create an OID that you're using internally within your jurisdiction, you don't show it anywhere. But if you're using it across Canada or potentially, you want to register at HL7 OID registry so that you get an OID that's at that level.
Right. But if you want to do that,
don't put the guidance in that says to company X, when you go and need an OID, you have to search here and then here and then here and then here. We just say, go make a request here. They'll do a search to tell you whether it exists or not. And then things go. So same thing here. We don't want to go, if we start putting in to drill down to say, well, you have to look at HL7, then you have to look at Canada, then you have to look at Alberta, BC, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and then you have to look at TELUS and Wolf and whatever other MicroQuest and whatever vendors registries to see if there's one. You know, what level does it end?
Well, okay, so let me say it again. All I said was from a high level perspective, indicate the international, the country, the province, the organization, the project. Don't name them. That would be concrete. If you want to leave the province out of that mix, you absolutely can. But then you will have provided guidance that with the provinces bring in lists, it's to be ignored. You can do it either way, but I would recommend you leave it in. And if the province creates something, then it would be in the filtering pattern. But I'm not supposing that you name them all.
Who are we trying to document that then? I guess is the question.
So right now, for instance, for naming systems, the BC policy is that if they have a name system / OID that's of Canadian interest, like for instance the identifier for the College of Physicians and Surgeons in British Columbia, those things are remaining in the Canadian naming system registry. In the BC section of Simplifier, where they have BC Core, the only things that are supposed to are going to remain there are things that are truly BC specific, but they'll still be visible. They're still going to be in BC Core in Simplifier, but they're not going to, because in the past, early on when we were doing this, we went through a phase where all of the stuff that BC cared about that was in the Canadian registry ended up in BC Core and Simplifier. And the policy is that they're going to stop doing that. If it's of Canadian interest, it goes in the Canadian URI registry. Anything else stays in the registry under BC. So I mean, we've already sort of talked about some of those policies, and I'm sure Ontario and other provinces are doing similar things. But and of course, how we manage the naming systems, the URI registry, and all of those things are not quite a baseline concern, but they're related to how we're managing the baseline profiles. So actually, if as we're talking about managing extensions, other than the ones that the baseline wishes to socialize and make reference to, the stuff beyond that is technically not part of the baseline concern, right?
Yeah, I would say that we point to HL7, we point to the Canadian one, but there should be a note on the Canadian one that says in your process of doing this, you might want to look at these jurisdictional ones. That's not part of our guidance here. I think it's a guidance in that registry.
Yeah, I would just say like, okay, in the interest of keeping it this like practical to what should be in the baseline guide, can we just read this and can someone tell me if they want me to change a word somewhere or words somewhere? Like, what do we think is going to be the most practical way, basically saying, you know, make sure you look at other people's work. If, you know, obviously check out what's in the baseline, but it's important to check other people's work to harmonize around. Is there anything that we want to change about this statement?
Looks good to me, but additional, as Laurie and what I heard from Randy and Laurie and Paul mentioned, I'm not sure it's the responsibility of the baseline, or we need to direct to the HL7 International, FHIR International, try to encourage and the users or potential implementers to have a good understanding about some technical concept here, as what I heard about URI, or more we call specific canonical URI of those extensions. What's their functionality from a business and technical perspective? It's very important to understand how to utilize those extensions.
Yeah, but from a practical perspective, 15 years ago, we determined at FHIR the first thing we needed to have in order to stop the proliferation of duplicate extensions was we needed to have a FHIR registry, and then we didn't act on it.
So I'm going to shift it back.
So if you could on the text here, if you could perhaps just add three extensively enter their use case and just to the end of that before defining a new extension.
All right. Anything else that we would want to modify about this statement? Because I actually think this is kind of like, this is important, but it's probably, we also have to move on to talking about getting some content down for purpose as well. So let's move to purpose. And then if you have modifications to this, I'm going to put this in chat so you guys can copy it. And if you want to modify something about it, oops, hold on. Put the full one, just copy and paste your edited version into the chat. And we can deal with that asynchronously. Okay. So writing for the purpose of socialized extensions. So I really liked what Elliot said earlier. I'm going to try to paraphrase it. You guys help me with the language as we go along. So the CA baseline. So identifies established extensions that are optional for the purposes of assisting iGuide authors in Canada with harmonization. Or do we want to just say for the purposes of reducing duplication of very commonly used extensions?
That's the goal. But that's only downstream very far away. And my understanding, try, that's what said, just first to increase exposure and the possible reusability of all those existing extension. From that matter, when demand goes high, we could go to the harmonization process. Eventually, we can decrease possible duplication.
Yeah, I would suggest removing commonly used.
Okay.
Because if it's used, if you have two extensions, you've just trashed interoperability.
So, expect to be reusable and, um, what is it called? I'm just gonna put the word valid right now. We can come back and fix it. Relevant. These extensions are optional. Added to the CA baseline profile, but not constrained, e.g. The intent for socializing is to reduce duplication of
Duplication and unwarranted variation.
I like that. I don't know if I'm spelling it right, but I like it. All right, so its baseline identifies established extensions that speaks to that they already exist that are expected to be reusable and relevant across jurisdictions and use cases. These extensions are optional, added to the baseline profile, but not constrained. The overall intent for socializing these extensions is to reduce duplication and unwarranted variation of extensions.
Can I get a little bit of details about what means this extension are optional? Because optional within this CA baseline domain, it has been given a very specific definition already. Just want to avoid any polysemy issues here. Thank you.
Should we then just maybe take our added but not constrained? Is that better?
I would like to make it more loose, and I don't, I don't want to put my perspective. Don't want need to put any legal disclaimer, but there's no any responsibility from baseline community for any issues that comes from that adoption of those extensions. Is that right? I think just FYI or for your consideration, make it loose as possible.
Yeah, I guess let me think about how to incorporate that in.
Maybe something about are maintained elsewhere or something like that.
But are ultimately maintained elsewhere?
Elsewhere or by other organizations or whatever, yeah. I mean, an example, for instance, is the gender harmony extension for gender identity, right? It's part of the HL7 International extension pack, and it's managed by other groups outside of Canada, although many of us are using it already.
I'm not sure, may we consider to add in, first, Lauren, your words are very good, great, but ultimately governed and maintained by other projects. Obviously, this authority is very important because it's not under pan-Canadian baseline authority, but that's my understanding.
This is a working group, right? That's a.
Yeah, it's a form, well, we actually I don't think we actually have a formal existence. We're doing our own governance within ourselves, so.
No, I mean, the section gender
Um,
one.
Yeah.
So just say
Oh,
project
no, that's not a working group.
implementation guide.
Oh, well, HL7, HL7 Canada has a sex and gender working group. HL7 International does not.
But the one that's governing and maintaining the
Gender identity extension? Yeah, that's actually a project underneath the terminology infrastructure work group.
like. Well, I think section gender harmony, like maybe it's implementation guide might be a because that
Yeah, that's right.
kind of understand that better than the terminology call out.
Yes, that's
Okay.
better. They're referencing the implementation guide, although it's only called gender harmony. It doesn't say sex and gender harmony.
So what do we think about this then? Do we want to make further edits? And my other question is, there's only a couple other things, like we call it the fact that it's optional, that it's established, and that they come from other guides and that they're reusable, which are kind of the tenets that we use for evaluation and like identifying what should be a socialized extension. So if the only thing that's I think missing is just an indication that like we don't create net new extensions that don't exist before. If we find a way to put this in purpose, can we just remove the process one because it talks about all of the tenets of like how we choose in the purpose section?
Why is there no creation of net new extensions?
When we discussed it in relation to, I don't think it was the BC request, but the idea was that we at the time knew that there were going to be projects that were focused on the creation of kind of future looking concepts and the extensions for harmonization. And so rather than try to tackle some of them in the baseline and maybe model them differently than they would be modeled in like the PCH, DCF or core, that we said like we would have either like a fulsome or a temporary hiatus from creating anything net new.
Okay, so the
Yes, so
baseline's not going to,
I-
it's going to defer that to some other process.
Yeah, I think the other piece is the baseline wasn't going to create something net new to compete with things that were already out there. If we identified a baseline need that really did need a new extension in the baseline that we thought met the criteria, the same kind of criteria we used to include the profile in the baseline, I think we would create one, but we weren't trying to create stuff to compete with things that are already defined.
Okay, I heard something slightly different, which is should we define a need for a new thing, it would actually be deferred to some external process. And then once existing, adopted into the baseline.
This one was in the scope of a request. So if we received a request, and I think that is true. Like if we receive a request that comes from an outside party, we'll triage that request elsewhere. Lorraine, I think your comment was more around we might have freedom in the future to develop that if it was something that was determined to be necessary based on our development work.
Yes.
So I think we can at least make the first statement, which is, let me just try to put it in a sentence, and then we can figure out if it needs to be in this purpose or another subsection. Baseline, let me actually see the exact language that we used. Will not in scope development of new. Okay, I'm gonna copy and paste this and then I'm gonna tweak it. In order to reduce. Raised through other projects. We could just say extra, so we could say more, we could not say more. I'm just putting it as in like an EG right now, but this covers, like, we're not currently in scope to do this, which covers the, you know, doesn't railroad us in the future if there were scenarios where we did want to do this. The purpose for why we don't create net new extensions, and then just indicating that we'll raise them to other projects, giving these more as examples. What do folks think? Are there things that we would want to change about this? I can put the full one in the chat because I'm seeing we've got 1 minute left for folks to kind of chew on. I won't push it into the CI build if we're not comfortable with it yet, but if we are comfortable, we can at least document what we know. Do we think we'll want to tweak this a little bit more? I'll save it if so. With just a note, I'll say. I'm to future call. The only thing I'm just sensitive to is like if we want this to be included in 1.2, which it definitely doesn't have to be, that it might keep us from packaging until we finalize on this language. Do folks want to do that? Or do we want to package with 1.2 and have this be one of the first things that we get done for 2.0? Because 1.2 package is not going to include iGuide pages anyway.
I think the 1.2 is mostly tended to be technical things. So I'm happy with it being in 2.0 instead of 1.2. I don't know what others think.
If okay. Let us know if you're not comfortable with that approach. To Lorraine's point, 1.2 is really just to focus on changes to the actual profiles themselves. So I'll save this. I'm not gonna put it to the CI build, but it will be something that we probably will be able to nail down for one of the first releases of 2.0 that will let us to package for 1.2 in like the next week. All right. With that in mind, we didn't get to the second agenda item, but we will just have to cover that on one of our next calls. Have a wonderful weekend, folks, and I will chat with many of you next Friday.